So let's go ahead and, if there are not any more questions, we can go ahead and open with a word of prayer, and we can jump in here. It's sort of fun. And I find this class, this particular session, to be the most persuasive argument for God's existence of anything that I have seen in the last 20 years.
Wow.
So I think it's pretty powerful stuff. Anyway, Lord, be with us today. Give us your wisdom. Give us your truth. Help us to see your design in the world. And open our minds to challenge maybe other preconceptions that we have so that we can ultimately follow you better. Thank you for allowing us to be here today, and thank you for everyone here. Also, yearning for truth. We pray this in your name. Amen. So, would you mind while you're sitting up, can you shut the door for me? Loud kids last week, and there's no fun allowed here, so I don't want to hear any laughing. Anyway, so first thing we want to discuss, we talked about there's this idea that there's information in our DNA. It was kind of mentioned last week. This is actually a pretty profound statement. So I want to talk a little bit about what information actually is. Like, how can we define it? Because normally when we look for information, you're just like, well, you kind of know it when you see it. Like, you go over there and you open up one of those books. You're like, okay, that's information. I knew it. Okay. Tim's looking at it. He's like, wait, what's that? So, if we look around here, we see all these written words on a piece of paper. And we're like, that is definitely information. And we can see lots of examples of it too. So does anyone know what this is? It's the Rosetta Stone. Yeah, it's a really famous stone here. There's 3 different languages. I believe it's ancient Greek, hieroglyphics, and then the Demotic script. And so it's actually the thing that allowed us, Rosetta Stone. Not just learning software. That's funny. Okay. Hey, I was right. Cool. And basically, this was they found this right about 1800, and it allowed them to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics. All right. The question really is how could they possibly have figured out this wasn't just a chance arrangement of erosion? I mean, what was it about the Rosetta Stone? We can look at it again. How did they ever figure out that this wasn't just an accident of erosion and, random pebbles striking the stone from storms and stuff? Like, how did they possibly determine that? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Maybe that because it's hieroglyphic, so then it look like. Because then, if it eroded, it wouldn't have that.
Yeah. I feel like if wind wouldn't have corresponded to an independent language that we knew of, right? You have 3 different independent languages, right? And everyone's like, well, duh. Of course we knew this. This is really obvious. It's painfully obvious. All right. But there's some properties of information that we can sort of say, like, how is it that our brain makes that conclusion? How can we determine, okay, this is definitely information? So one of them is that there's a very complex arrangement of things. So, I mean, the way those little scratches in the stone, it's like really, really complicated. It feels too complicated somehow to have happened by chance, which gives me to my next point. There's a very low probability that something like this would happen. Okay, so again, if you just drop a bunch of knives on the Rosetta Stone, it's not going to randomly come in 3 different languages saying the same message. Right? We know that that's probably not going to take place. So we know that it has a complex arrangement. It's really complicated, very low probability that something like this would happen by chance. There's a third thing that's, I think, the most important here, and that it means something. And this is kind of a little harder to put your finger on, but I think we'll hopefully be able to unpack this today. But the idea of something has a meaning. Basically, if I write something down, for example, I write the word, that's kind of bad. Here, somebody catch. That was a terrible throat tone, I'm sorry. So if I write down something here, all right, That's the name of my classroom. Okay, so I'm Mr. Calbeck. So if I write this down here, there's nothing about the ink that tells you what this word means. There's nothing about the whiteboard that tells you about what this means. Nothing about anything that makes this up tells you, okay, that's referring to Calbeck's classroom. Okay, I'm the dictator of Calbeckistan, by the way. All my students are peasants and they have no rights. I think it's pretty cool. So, the thing that allows you to understand what this means is the arrangement of these letters. It's all about the organization. And this refers to something completely separate from the ink and the whiteboard and everything else. It means something totally else. It refers to an independent idea away from the board and the ink. Does that kind of make sense? Again, there's nothing about this or the whiteboard or anything else that tells you what this means. It's your independent knowledge of what these symbols mean, their arrangement, and this other place, this mystical land of Calbeckistan, okay? Your knowledge is what tells you what this means. It refers to something else, okay? And that's the idea. There's, meaning has to have this external representation. I have to be talking about something else that has nothing to do with, for example, the stone. The stone itself had nothing to do with the language it's written on, the Rosetta Stone. But the arrangement of the letters, talking about an individual language and then those words that corresponded to the message, were all completely separate from the stone. That's how we see information. That's how we understand that there's meaning behind stuff. All right. So it's another great example. Anybody familiar with what SETI is? It's kind of a fun acronym.
Nope.
Search for extraterrestrial.
Let's get the last one. Intelligence. Very good.
Yeah.
Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's an organization been going around for 30 or 40 years now. And they've got these huge telescopes that are scanning the sky looking for signals, essentially. And they're trying to find, evidence for intelligence. And what do you think they're looking for in those radio signals?
Information.
They're looking for information. And the thing is, we can kind of understand what information is. We see that it's somehow like an external representation. It's not the light itself, but the light it means something else. Okay, it's the radio signals that correspond to something else. And so mostly what they're looking for is they would be looking for, they would see, this is essentially what their radio telescopes would see. And if they came up with, some signals and they're like, all right, just random signals happen all the time. Stars are doing different things and rotating and things are orbiting each other and it creates all these sort of patterns. But a regular repeating pattern doesn't necessarily mean anything. So what SETI is probably, most of the time that they're looking for, is they'd be looking for a really specific pattern, something that seems to not have any correspondence to anything else. So if they saw the signals show up like this, and they're like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, who knows what the next one would be? 13, 17, okay, and they're like, wait, do we know what these are? They're the prime numbers. So the radio signals, if they corresponded precisely to an order of prime numbers, they'd be like, wait. That's something else. Numbers are completely separate from the stars and the orbits and everything else. And the prime numbers, the fact that, by the way, prime number, for those of you who aren't in math right now, prime number is divisible only by 1 and itself. So kind of fun in mathematics, we can play with a lot of things. There's an unlimited number of prime numbers, so this list could go as long as you want it. But if we saw this in the sky, we're like, wait, numbers actually, we can use numbers to describe stars, but numbers themselves are sort of independent. And so what SETI's been looking for from the sky is like a list of prime numbers or some other independently verifiable list of information. Okay? And that's kind of what we'd be trying to find. So, again, hey, cool. If we saw that in radio signals, it would imply information. It would imply And more importantly, why would SETI be looking for this? Why would SETI be looking for information? Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Why would they care if there's information in radio signals? This is really the key point for today.
I'm assuming that
Something created this intelligence.
Right. Information doesn't happen by accident. Information always has somebody who made it, somebody who wrote it, somebody who designed it, okay? Somebody who etched it. Information never happens by accident. In every case we've ever found in all of human history, it doesn't happen by accident, ever. Okay? And it's how we're allowed to see, when we look at ancient ruins and we see, information can take lots of forms. And we go dig stuff up and we're like, oh wow, that looks purposeful. It looks like this may have meant something. We don't even have to know the language. You don't have to know very much about the independently verified object to know, well, I'm pretty sure somebody made that. Or other times you might see, maybe you got like a weird etching, like where'd it go? You're digging in a cave, like that looks like a crab or something, right? Again, the independently verified thing, we don't have to know the language or anything about these people, but we can always determine, wow, I think somebody made that. Because we always know when we see information, we can always sort of determine it. And information source is always an intelligence. Somebody had to make it.
What about the face on Mars?
The face on Mars. That's a good question, and there are other things where you can have sort of accidental, and I can show you another slideshow of examples like that. And the man on the moon, right, looks a lot like a man. Okay, but there have to be eventually complex and low probability enough that we can rule out chance. So again, the Rosetta Stone versus the man on the moon, man on the moon, it's just like a couple of asteroid impacts. You can see it wasn't low probability enough. Okay, here's another example. This, I put some rocks on a table outside, and there's like a lot of, it's really low probability that it would have fallen just this way. Like, fantastically low probability. I could dump those rocks on the table, and they would never again be in this arrangement. I could do it for the rest of my life, and it would never happen. But we also know, even though there's low probability, that's not information. However, if I dropped them onto the table, and this happened, okay, then you see, and we all laughed, right? Because it's obvious. We're like, oh, that's clever, Robert. I see what you did there. You spelled your name. And you all know that I did this. Like, not one of you thought, like, wow, I wonder how long he dropped the rocks on the table before that happened. You all know that didn't happen. Every single one of you. Because again, we see there's nothing about the rocks or the glass table or anything else or the way that I dropped them that made that into my name now. That name corresponds to something outside of the rocks and everything else. It represents me. And we always know, every time we see information, that somebody did it. Somebody made it. Somebody arranged it for a purpose. All right, so again, those are sort of examples here. Well, that's not what I wanted. I think I missed a bunch of slides here. I know where it is though, so hold on 1 second. I know where the slides are. Don't look real quick. Okay. All right, so which of these represents information? Okay. This in the clouds, that looks an awful lot like a flying horse to me.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Pretty cool. I remember seeing this once in the clouds, and I thought it was really cool.
Wow.
Is that information? And that corresponds to independently, it's an independent idea of the shape of a heart, and it's in the clouds. Is that information? Yeah, maybe. Probably not. Right? We understand that there's a range of where probability and accident could have made a heart that way. But then, if you see this in the sky, okay, we're now suddenly pretty sure at this point that this is definitely somebody who wrote that. Well, an airplane. It's pretty impressive, actually. Okay, so we understand like which of those three things really does represent information. We all understand that. Okay, I'm not sure why I put that in the other slideshow, but that's okay. All right, there we go. Oh, this is a pretty good example. All right, so, and so here's the thing. In every case of information we've ever seen, information has an intelligent cause. This is always true. This is not a surprise to anybody. We use it in forensics. We use it in archaeology. We use it in SETI. Okay, in every case, we know that information corresponding to an independently designed thing, like name of my country or the words and hieroglyphics, we always understand that this has an intelligent cause. Okay. The other thing that's really interesting about language and information is you also kind of, not only is the arrangement important, but we also have to sort of understand what these things mean, right? Something has to decipher this. In a computer, you actually have several layers of computer code. We often talk about information being binary, like 0 and 1 in a computer, but there's also like a second layer of this, and a third layer that you actually see. So there's the source code and then the byte code, and then you actually get to see an output. So there's actually 3 layers. So you actually have to teach the computer how to read zeros and ones and interpret them, and then arrange them, and then output what we see in a computer. So there's actually multiple layers. We do this naturally as humans. Our intelligence allows us to decipher things, but there's a lot of different layers to this. Okay? And here's the thing that just is baffling to me. We have information in DNA. We have information in DNA. And not just like a small amount of information. Okay? So, Tim, you want to grab one of those Bibles from behind you? All right? If I were to take this and digitize it in zeros and ones, in simplest format, I could put everything in this Bible in less than 5 megabytes of information. Okay, that's less than 5 million bytes of information. Byte is 8 bits. Guess how much information is in the human genome? It's about 3 billion megabytes, or 3 billion bytes, or 3 gigabytes of information, or, to put it in perspective, about 1,000 Bibles of information in every single one of your cells. Not a little bit of information, not I heart you in the sky, which we all instantly know somebody made, somebody designed. The human genome is about 1,000 Bibles worth of information in every single one of your cells. That should absolutely blow your mind. That we are looking for, a small sequence of prime numbers, and we would adequately and correctly determine aliens did that. But we see 1,000 Bibles of information in our cells, and we assume that it wasn't somebody that created it. It is absolutely baffling to me. And I want to start digging into how exactly DNA works. That's totally going to fall off. Because DNA we hear about all the time, but I think a lot of people may not really understand how it works. DNA is literally the blueprint for how you make people and frogs and bacteria. It gives the instructions for creating every organism we have. Every single organism is based on this. And before somebody you say viruses, some viruses are based on RNA, but we don't actually consider them to be alive. So that's why that sort of gets in there. Okay? And what they do essentially, DNA is the blueprint, and one of the primary things that DNA does is it gives you instructions for building proteins. And we saw last week that video explaining just how complicated proteins are and just how fantastic it is. When you look at the inside of a cell, you see this incredible factory. A factory that has the ability to build itself. Build copies of itself. Like, that's a fantastically complicated technology. Okay, and so the DNA is the instructions for the proteins. Okay, here's a picture of DNA. You've probably seen a ton of stuff like this over the years. And essentially the way it works is the outside of the DNA is this sugar phosphate compound. That's the kind of the outside of the ladder, if you think about it. And between the ladder, you see two compounds that join together to make the rungs of the ladder. Okay, there's 4 different letters, usually abbreviated A, T, G, and C. But it's adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Okay, so those are it doesn't matter, they can all fit together in any order, just like we could write the letters of the alphabet in any order. Okay, and so it's the arrangement or how those compounds fit together that makes up the code. Very similar to how we would say zeros and ones make a string of information. Except this has 4 bits of information rather than 2 bits of information in binary. Okay, but the same idea. Okay? So, we talked about this last week, this idea of transcription. That's what we call the process of new protein formation. I've got a little animation for you here that'll help in a minute. But the way that this works is a really cool protein called RNA polymerase. And what it does is it basically makes a copy of the DNA, which is really cool. And then ships that, so like if you have the master plan for your building, if you were to make a copy of 1 page and go hand it to the electrician or something, be like, okay, here's what you need to do for the electrical for this room. Okay, that's essentially what RNA polymerase does. It makes a copy of a small section of the DNA, and it's going to say, all right, here we go. And now I can take this 1 piece of paper, I don't have to have the whole giant book, just take this 1 piece of paper and I'm going to go work with it. So it will then, it turns it into something called messenger RNA. You've probably heard of mRNA because of that's where the vaccines are coming from. They actually use this. And so that's where that is, mRNA. That mRNA then is shipped out of the nucleus to a place called a ribosome, which is not just 1 protein, it's a whole collection of proteins working together in this really complicated process where it takes the 1 page of the blueprint and then uses it to build new proteins. All right, here's a picture of the RNA polymerase. It's a diagram here. And you can see how it works. It kind of eats the DNA from one end, unravels it, and then you'll see that it's making this green piece is a copy of the DNA, and then it zips it back together. Okay? This is the messenger RNA that will then leave the nucleus. This is a very simplified version of it. The actual way that this looks is something more like this. Remember, we talked last week very briefly about how chains of amino acids fold to form proteins. Again, I have another animation for you. I hope this works. Okay, cool, it does.
Here is a cell, the basic unit of all living tissue. In most human cells, there is a structure called the nucleus.
I don't have it on this one, I'm sorry.
The nucleus contains the genome. In humans, the genome is split between 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each chromosome contains a long strand of DNA, tightly packaged around proteins called histones. Within the DNA are sections called genes. These genes contain the instructions for making proteins. When a gene is switched on, an enzyme called RNA polymerase attaches to the start of the gene. It moves along the DNA, making a strand of messenger RNA out of free bases in the nucleus. The DNA code determines the order in which the free bases are added to the messenger RNA. This process is called transcription. Before the messenger RNA can be used as a template for the production of proteins, it needs to be processed. This involves removing and adding sections of RNA. The messenger RNA then moves out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. Protein factories in the cytoplasm, called ribosomes, bind to the messenger RNA. The ribosome reads the code in the messenger RNA to produce a chain made up of amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acid. Transfer RNA molecules carry the amino acids to the ribosome. The messenger RNA is read 3 bases at a time. As each triplet is read, a transfer RNA delivers the corresponding amino acid.
That's the purple thing on the top. It's not
This is
what it looks like.
added to a growing chain of amino acids. Once the last amino acid has been added, the chain folds into a complex 3D shape to form the protein.
That's kind of a brief description of how DNA works. It gives you the blueprints for building different parts of the cell. And there can be thousands upon thousands of different proteins in every cell to make it work.
Question.
Yeah.
How do you know where a gene starts and stops in the chain?
That's a great question. There actually is a specific codon, that's that little 3-section part of DNA, and it codes for the start and stop sequence.
Huh.
And so that when the polymerase goes through, it sees the start one, it's like, okay, cool, this is what I need, and it starts reading it, and then it gets to a stop code. Okay, so it's actually built into DNA.
So when they say DNA has, in your body, you have X number of genes, when they decoded the whole thing, they actually were able to see all the combinations.
Exactly. And the thing
You
is,
could say those are kind of like words or something.
exactly, yeah. So it's kind of like, if you remember, well, if you remember, I don't think you're that old, but like if you've seen movies with telegrams,
Yeah.
and so then there's little codes to say like stop or like begin, and so like you have all this message and you get a little code and that tells you, okay, start recording, and then you know in telegrams there's always the word stop, and that means it's the end of a line of, and so it's the same idea in genes. There's a little code that says start and stop. Okay, and DNA actually does a lot more than just code for proteins. It teaches cells how to arrange them, and there's a lot more to it than just coding for proteins. But that is probably the simplest thing that we understand the best about how DNA works. We're still uncovering exactly how DNA works. We actually have no idea how a lot of it works yet. And we'll dig into that more later. But this part we understand pretty well, the translation and transcription piece. Okay? But again, DNA is incredibly complex. We talked about, looking at the Rosetta Stone. This is millions of Rosetta Stones of information. So it definitely gets to the complicated piece. It has incredibly low probability in arrangement, right? Just the way that the A's, T's, C's, and G's all arrange together, like the odds of that are way less than you dropping the rocks and having them form Robert. But here's the thing that makes DNA information. It's not the low probability and it's not the complexity. The thing that makes DNA information is that it means something. The DNA codes for proteins, an independent thing that has nothing to do with the DNA or anything else, or the arrangement of those chemicals or the sugar phosphate background. It has nothing to do with any of those things. It's an independent thing that it means, that it codes for, that it represents. And whether that's, when we see a cave drawing or like a sculpture of a crab or something, the stone again isn't the crab. We know what a crab looks like. It corresponds to that. When you see language and words and things like that, you know this means something. Numbers mean something. It has nothing to do with what it's made of. It has everything to do that it means something outside of itself. And the fact that we have that in DNA, again, should baffle you. It's literally a code. Okay, so then we have to ask ourselves, how did the information get there? Because there's really only two possibilities. Either it happened by accident, or somebody wrote it. Again, if you look in your operating system of your computer or your phone, we don't assume that, like we said, random number generators making that code. You know that there's a lot of computer engineers that spend a lot of time and effort and hopefully made a lot of money writing that code. We always know that codes are written by a person, by intelligence, by someone. And so you have to ask yourself, which possibility makes more sense? With chance, I've actually never seen another case where chance produces information, particularly not in the quantities we're talking about. 1,000 Bibles worth of information is a lot. Okay? And therefore, since we've never seen another case of this ever, and has been verified that this is not the case in every other situation, it makes it not a scientific theory. Because you can test it and prove that it never happens. Okay? But it's the only possibility that means there's not a higher power. So you're kind of stuck with this.
If you're an atheist. Or design, of course.
Okay? The other possibility is design, of course. Right? Okay? And here's the question. It fits the evidence. Because again, we see information, we see meaning in DNA, which is where we see information has meaning everywhere else. Somebody wrote it, or somebody made it, or somebody etched it, or sculpted it, or something. Okay? It's absolutely supported by the evidence, which actually makes it a scientific theory, because we can test it, and we can see it, and we can reproduce it. It actually makes it a proper scientific theory. The problem is, it has the downside of having some metaphysical implications. See if you can sign metaphysical a few more times. I'm sure that's...
Why is that a downside?
Well, that's the problem, right?
Is that language? Is that intelligence? Maybe
I
the
think it
problem
might
is with
be.
the person who's creating the code.
I think it might be. Okay? I'm being sarcastic when I say downside. But it does force people to confront presuppositions they may have. It may make some people wrong if they want to know the truth.
You're ignoring evolution.
Well, how do you think what do you think the mechanism of evolution is? Chance
Well,
acting upon random mutations.
Yeah, my confirmation, my pastor, when I was confirmed, said, science tells you how, and religion tells you who.
We're going to talk a lot about evolution. But evolution at its core isn't an explanation of where the information comes from or how to generate new information. It tells you what happens to the information once it's there. In the process of creating new information, it fails spectacularly to explain. Because essentially it would say, and we're actually going to look at an example of why evolution can't work here, just in a very brief sense. Okay? So we're going to test it right here. So again, we're going to spend 3 weeks on evolution, so you'll hear all about it, and we're going to get into deep dive of all the stuff. Yeah. Well, this we're talking about information, and so we're kind of getting toward that idea. There's a lot to it, so we have to sort of build it up from the ground. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this sentence right here. We're going to change this sentence is true to this sentence is false, and we're going to do it by chance. Okay? That's what we're going to do. I think I got the right number of letters here. Let's see. Yep. Perfect. So, we're going to start from here. And I put a little space here so it's the same number of letters. Okay, we'll have a blank. And here's how it works. So we're going to play a game. Here's the rules. And we're all going to play together. We're going to play the evolution game. All right, so it's really hard to change a letter because we don't want things in life to change very easily. All right, so we're gonna roll a dice, and your goal is you have to roll a 6 first. Okay, if you roll a 6, you get to change any one of these letters. Okay, we're gonna go through one at a time. All right. If you roll a 6, then you get the next awesomeness. You get to roll a 20-sided die because there's 20 amino acids that make up the human body, or pretty much all life. And this will correspond to a random letter. And we're going to see if we can change the sentence. All right? So if you misspell any words, then you lose. Okay? So here's the code for the 20-sided die. All right, so that's what we're going to try to do here.
There's no T.
I know, so you're going to have to hope that you don't change the T. Right? So, all right, let's start. We'll go around. Let's start rolling. Let's see if anybody can win. All right, got to roll a 6. Just throw. So we got. Anyone want to try to say this? To kiss and Kenjikas is true. You lose. Sorry, remember that was the rules. Any misspelled words means you have to lose. You lose, and we have to try again. All right, let's do it again, and then. Okay, that's not. Anyway, I decided to actually do the math on this, so don't feel too bad. Your odds, you want to guess the odds of actually being successful in this game, of changing it to this sentence is false?
How did you determine what letters to put up there when it was not a 6, that you would fill in?
Yeah, that's where this 20-sided die came into. So I just had a little code here.
Yeah.
So you got a 4, that was a D, for example.
That's when it was
Okay,
a
so
6.
that's
When it
what-
was not a 6, you didn't change.
You didn't get to change it if it wasn't a 6. Sorry. Okay? The odds are 1 in a trillion, give or take. Yeah. You're probably not going to win that game. I was pretty confident that you wouldn't. Yes?
You could change the 20-sided dice to mean any of a trillion different combinations.
Sure, absolutely could. But I chose a
And you would
20-sided.
still get the same nonsense response.
You would, yeah. I chose 20 because there are 20 different amino acids. So if you're randomly changing DNA, as would have to happen in an evolutionary sense or random chance sort of sense, basically any combination of those 4 base pairs you get about 20 different options. So mutations in real life work the same way. Okay, and then again, this is what evolution would suggest is how all the life came to exist and change. Okay. The only difference is instead of rolling a 6 to get you to change 1 base pair, turns out RNA polymerase and all these other enzymes are really accurate. They only make 1 error in about 100 million. So imagine a 100 million sided die, and you have to roll 100 million to be able to change one of the letters.
And that one letter would be the mutation.
Yep. So in order to get to roll the 20-sided die, you have to roll 100 million on this die first. That'd be a very large round die. Yeah.
It'd
What's that?
probably still say this sentence is true.
I probably wouldn't change it. Okay, so yeah, only 1 in 100 million DNA base pairs would mutate. Okay, so really, really hard to ever get to this dice.
But isn't it done so many times that like, well, 100, even if it's 1 in 100 million, there's still,
You're saying there's a chance.
You're saying there's a chance, but there's, if you're doing it, 10 trillion times every second, then.
Sure, exactly.
It could still come up, right?
Exactly. So the question is then, not whether mutations happen, because they do. In fact, every time you get cancer, it's caused by one of those. Okay, it happens to be a really negative mutation that makes cancers grow and things like that. So the only question really is, notice like these words are complete gibberish. They don't mean anything. If you're arranging amino acids, just like you would letters in an alphabet, what are the odds that you happen to spell something that makes sense? And that's really the question, right? Because it's not, like Tim said, you can have, there's quadrillions of bacteria in your body right now. That's a lot of chances. That's a bigger number than this. The question is, what's the likelihood that one of those random mutations will actually create something meaningful? Okay? So again, that's where you get the 20-sided dice. And just like our game, a spelling error means that your protein doesn't work and the cell will destroy it. Because it doesn't fold, it doesn't create a protein, it just is a chain of amino acids that's useless. Okay, so just like in our game, if you spelled something wrong, you lose. In life, you lose too. Okay? So the trick is, does chance have a chance? That's clever. All right. I got a video for you here. Let me go ahead and pull it up. And I do have closed captioning on. For whatever reason, it defaults to Bosnian. I have to change to each time. I'm not sure why.
Of new biological information. Biological form requires biological information.
Scientists' understanding of biological information advanced dramatically when Cambridge University researchers James Watson and Francis Crick made a startling discovery. They found that the structure of the DNA molecule stores information in the form of a 4-character digital code. Strings of precisely sequenced chemicals called nucleotide bases supply the assembly instructions, the information, for building the crucial protein molecules that living cells need to survive. Crick later came to realize that the chemical constituents in DNA function like letters in a written language, or digital symbols in a section of computer code. Just as English letters convey a particular message depending on their arrangement, the sequences of chemical bases along the spine of the DNA molecule convey precise instructions for building proteins. The arrangement of these bases directs the arrangement of the 20 different kinds of amino acids that make up protein molecules. Proteins, in turn, perform a vast array of critical jobs inside cells, catalyzing reactions, processing genetic information, and forming the structural parts of molecular machines and other biological structures. Building new animals requires many new protein molecules, and building new proteins requires new biological information.
I used to ask my students a question when I was teaching. If you want to give your computer a new function, what do you have to give it? And they would know. They would say code, or software, or instructions, a program. All those are the correct answer. To generate a new function in a computer, you have to have code. You have to have instructions. The same thing turns out to be true in biology. This is the great discovery of the second half of 20th century biology, that information is running the show in biological systems. To build a new form of animal life requires cell types, requires proteins, and therefore requires genetic information. And that's the big question that the Cambrian explosion presents. If you want to think about how to build an animal, how would these animals get built, you have to have some explanation for the informational requirements of their construction.
According to modern evolutionary theory, new proteins and new forms of animal life arise through random genetic mutations, sifted by natural selection. But in an alphabetic text or a section of computer code, random changes typically degrade meaning or functionality and ultimately generate gibberish.
As we've come to appreciate the digital or typographic character of genetic information, it raises some really interesting questions about the efficacy of that mutation-driven mechanism. We know from computer code, for example, that if you start making random changes to a section of computer code, you're much more likely to degrade the information that's there already than you are to come up with a new operating system or program.
This problem has long been recognized by computer scientists, mathematicians, and engineers, including a group from MIT who convened a now famous conference at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia in 1966. These scientists met to consider whether the random mutation natural selection mechanism could conceivably generate enough biological information to build a new animal or even a new protein in the time available to the evolutionary process. One of these scientists was MIT engineering professor Murray Eden.
No currently existing formal language can tolerate random changes in the symbol sequences which express its sentences. Meaning is almost invariably destroyed. Murray Eden, MIT.
Eden knew that random changes to alphabetic or digital characters inevitably degrade the information in any section of alphabetic text or digital code, and for a very good reason.
Whether you're talking about digital code in a software program or a section of text in an English sentence or book, or the genetic text in DNA, there are vastly more ways to arrange the relevant characters that convey the information in a way that will produce gibberish than there are that will produce function or meaning.
Eden and his colleagues suspected that the genetic code faced a similar difficulty. When it came to producing new genetic information, at least enough to generate a new protein, the random mutation natural selection mechanism had to deal with what mathematicians call a combinatorial problem. In mathematics, the term combinatorial refers to the number of possible ways that a set of objects can be arranged or combined. In genetics, the combinatorial problem poses a severe challenge to the random mutation natural selection mechanism. To understand why, imagine a thief who would like to steal a beautiful new bike. All that stands between the thief and the bike is a lock with 4 dials, each marked with the numbers 0 to 9. But there is only one correct combination that will set the bike free.
The reason a bike lock works is that there are vastly more ways of arranging those numeric characters that will keep the lock closed than there are that will open the lock.
A thief without knowledge of the combination must guess the right combination from among 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 possibilities. That's 10,000 possible combinations, which usually would be more than enough to defeat a random search for the one right combination. Yet there is still a way the thief might succeed. If he has enough time to try enough combinations, he might eventually identify the right one by chance. For example, if trying each combination takes 10 seconds, then in 15 hours an especially diligent thief could try more than 5,000 combinations, or more than half of the total possible combinations. In that case, he would be more likely to succeed than to fail in opening the lock. But now imagine a much more complicated lock. Instead of 4 dials, this lock has 10 dials. Instead of 10,000 possible combinations, this lock has 10 to the 10th power, or 10 billion possible combinations. With only one combination that will open the lock out of 10 billion, it's much more likely that the thief will fail, even if he devotes his entire life to the task. So what about relying on random mutations to search for a new DNA sequence capable of directing the construction of a new functional protein? Would such a random search for new genetic information be more likely to succeed or fail in the time available to the evolutionary process? In other words, is a random mutational search for a new gene or protein more like the search for the combination on the 4-dial lock, or the 10-dial lock? The scientists at the Wistar conference were unable to definitively answer that question because at the time, no one could adequately quantify how hard the search problem was.
So in the late 1960s, one could make these arguments based upon analogy to things we understood, written language, computer code, but we didn't have any experimental data to show whether those analogies actually suited the biological case. So no one could come up with the exact numbers to answer these questions back then.
Molecular biologists at the time did know that the number of possible combinations corresponding to any given sequence of DNA is extremely large and grows exponentially with the length of the molecule in question. For example, corresponding to one short protein 150 amino acids long, there are 10 to the 195th power other amino acid arrangements of that length. That's an unimaginably large number. But scientists in the 1960s didn't know how many of those arrangements were actually functional. They didn't know, in effect, how many combinations would open the lock. That didn't stop evolutionary biologists from speculating. Many argued that there must be a high proportion of functional sequences among all possible sequences, so that a random search for a new functional sequence would have a high probability of success.
The way they did that is to say, well, maybe biological sequences are not nearly as finicky, not nearly as picky about which characters are where as written languages or as computer code is. And so that's the track that they took. That maybe proteins don't really care which amino acid is where, and there's a great deal of variability, and therefore you can have the same function performed by a huge number of protein chains and a huge number of genes.
But recent experiments in molecular biology and protein science have replaced speculation with data. These experiments have established that DNA-based sequences capable of making functional proteins are in fact extremely rare among the vast number of possible sequences. Just how rare? After working at Cambridge University, molecular biologist Douglas Axe set out to answer that question, using a technique called site-directed mutagenesis. His experiments enabled him to estimate that for every DNA sequence that generates a functional protein of just 150 amino acids in length, there are 10 to the 77th amino acid arrangements that will not fold into a stable three-dimensional protein structure capable of performing that biological function. One correct sequence for every 10 to the 77th power incorrect sequences. That's equivalent to searching for just one combination on a lock with 10 digits on each of 77 dials. To put this in perspective, keep in mind that there are only 10 to the 65th atoms in the entire Milky Way galaxy. Could random genetic mutations effectively search a space of possibilities that large in order to find even a single functional protein sequence?
So given that you have this very daunting probability, 1 in 10 to the 77th power, how could something that improbable happen? Well, as we know generally with improbable things, the way that they can happen is by having lots and lots of opportunities for them to happen. So for life, those opportunities take the form of individual living organisms in which a mutation could occur that could conceivably provide a solution. No matter how rare it is, if you get enough of these opportunities, it can become probable. So the question is, if the number is 1 in 10 to the 77th power, if that's the improbability that must be overcome, would the number of organisms that have existed on the planet since the beginning of life come close to matching that number? And it turns out that it doesn't come anywhere close.
During the entire 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth, it is estimated that only 10 to the 40th individual organisms have ever lived. Yet 10 to the 40th power represents only a small fraction of 10 to the 77th power. Only 1 10 trillion trillionth to be exact. In other words, for even a single functioning protein fold to arise, the mutation selection mechanism would have time to search just a tiny fraction of the total number of relevant sequences, 1 10 trillion trillionth of the total possibilities. It follows that it is overwhelmingly likely that a random mutational search would have failed to produce even one new functional protein fold in the entire history of life on Earth.
And I'll send you guys that video. So, what do you guys think? I'll turn the light back on.
Is it per organism or is it per DNA strand?
What do you mean?
For the chances, they said there was 10 to the 40th organisms out there.
That was for protein. So keep in mind, if you want to create a new, so say I want to turn a fish into a frog or something, right? I need to make changes to the fish. But the fish isn't going to change in the middle of its life. The only way that it can change is if you have a mutation that's then passed on to its offspring. So essentially every life born is another chance for that mutation to be passed on and create a new organism. So when you're talking about the total number of animals, that's the total number of chances something could happen.
And that's assuming you're starting with DNA that
Correct.
actually functions.
Right, and we talked about last week how unlikely it is and just how, frankly, unreasonable it is to assume that life could have arisen by chance in the first place. But once you get life, then assuming that you can change it, again, you only can really do that once per life before it, every time you're born, you get a chance to have a new trait that you could then pass on and mutate again to something else. Does that sort of answer your question?
Sure.
Okay.
Every time you have a fertilized new cell.
Mm-hmm. Or in case of bacteria where you're just
Yeah.
splitting cells or things like that. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be sexual reproduction. It can be all kinds of other things. Okay, so anytime a cell reproduces in any way, and you just end up with just a fantastically low chance that this could have ever happened ever. So, and I told you I'll give you the best counterpoints to this argument. Again, I find this incredibly compelling. So are there any counterpoints? I mean, I've looked. There are a few things that people say, but I find them so ridiculous and not helpful. So oftentimes this is derided as pseudoscience. That'll be the most common thing that people say, like, oh, that's not science to look at information and mathematics. That's not science at all. That's pseudoscience. What real science is assuming something that we've never seen happen, have no evidence for, happened. That's what science is. So
there's no counterpoint?
There are not any good ones. So usually the only counterpoint you'll ever read is essentially mocking the argument. So people would claim like, oh, Calbeck's just a creationist. He's so dumb. Like that's the best counter argument. Like, but yeah, but what about the points I brought up? Yeah, but you're just a creationist. It's pseudoscience. Like you still haven't addressed the point. Yeah, it's pseudoscience. that's it. Honestly, that's the and they're try to use big fancy words and stuff, but that's not really good. And again, we talked about chance is just a spectacular fail. It fails spectacularly to explain what we see. Mathematically, it does not make sense. Every time I meet a mathematician who has a PhD in mathematics, they're always Christians.
The multi-verse could be a good.
It could. Well, multiverse beats chance. So another one you get is they give stuff a cool name, which really helps. So you get cool names like evolution. I think that's a cool name. That doesn't explain how things happen though. Abiogenesis, that's a really cool word. And that's what they will teach you. Well, how do you know life happened by chance? Because of abiogenesis. That's just a word. That's not an explanation. If you come up with a fancy word that actually doesn't give any description. Punctuated equilibrium. That's a really cool phrase we'll talk about, I think, next week? I can't remember. Next week or the week after. And it's basically an addition they added to evolution to try to explain this stuff. And it also fails spectacularly to explain anything. It's just a cool word. So basically come up with a cool word, that means it's true, right? Abiogenesis. That's a cool word. I'm not making this up. Like that is the 100% total of the description.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have this vague recollection that punctuated equilibrium is the the counter to gradualism,
Correct.
which no one ever believed.
Correct.
So it was kind of like a ploy to sell books.
Yeah.
If you
It's in every textbook though.
Yeah.
Okay? And of course, you can always have multiverse, because if you have an infinite number of chances, this is guaranteed to happen. One in this. Guaranteed. It'll happen an infinite number of times.
Isn't the point with this that you don't have an infinite number of chances, or
Correct.
infinite number of time, because Earth had a beginning, and
Correct.
even at conservative, you said it was like 3 billion, 4 billion years old. So life has to there's a limited time
There's
frame.
yep.
So you only have so much time to pick that lock.
Correct. And that's exactly the point, right? You've got from the beginning of life on Earth, which again, they think is about 3.5 billion years ago, we get the first single-celled organisms and start changing the atmosphere. And it's about 500 million years ago where we start seeing complicated life form. So really, it's not even that 3 billion, it's about 500 million years that we have for this to happen, and it's just, there's no chance. Yeah.
Explain the Cambrian explosion, that's part of the argument here.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in more detail next time, but the Cambrian explosion essentially says that, again, the idea of evolution is that things change one at a time, and it slowly changes from one organism to another. And what we see instead of the Cambrian explosion is you start with basically bacteria, and then you go to all the complexity of life on Earth that we see like that. In fact, more complexity of life than we actually see today, which is it's crazy, and it just happens in about 10 million years. So we just see like go from bacteria to everything from crabs to snails to fish to every kind of thing. We organize them in biology by phylum, and there were 47 phylums that developed after there only being one in 10 million years. And it's insane. So you don't actually see a gradual thing, you see it emerge all at once. But again, we'll discuss that in more detail next time.
But even if you look at something that did happen fairly quickly, like domesticating dogs,
We're going to talk about dogs specifically, actually.
oh good.
Yeah.
But you're never going to be able to domesticate a dog into a jaguar or a rhinoceros.
Come on, there's a ton of good happen. Punctuated equilibrium. It happens. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And one of the things that actually concerns a lot of biologists today is the nature of degradation of DNA, actually. Because remember, when you make mutations, you always get less information than you started with. And what people are worried about as they're seeing this are like, whoa, that's a problem.
Is that because of enthalpy?
It's a big piece of it, yeah.
I'm sorry, because of what?
Enthalpy?
Entropy. Entropy is the idea that things become more disordered over time. But the idea is like, oh wow, so as species get older, we're just going to lose information. Genes will evaporate and die. Like we're just going to species and everything degrade over time, and that's sort of alarming. And people are starting to realize that, and it's actually it's a point of fear, at least for the far future. They're like, whoa.
Not for Christians, though.
That is true.
We know Jesus will come back again.
We're not real worried about that. So, anyway, we're essentially forced to confront the question when we see genetic information. Not where does genetic information come from? That's a bad question. I think the only question you can ask when confronted with genetic information is, from whom does information come from? This person always creates information. And we see every time we try to do it by chance, it fails spectacularly. The only source of information we've ever seen is one that comes from intelligence. And again, I think for the Christian, that's a good sign, because that's what we see exactly in the Bible. We see an intelligence that purposely created all these different organisms and animals with a purpose. Man's purpose was to name them. Okay? So next week, we're going to discuss evolution. We're going to go into great detail on what the theory says. We talked a little bit about it today in terms of how it acts on random chance on this, but we're going to go deep dive into that theory, and it is a cool name. So that's one thing it has going for it. But we're gonna deal with the math of it. We're gonna talk about what it says and what it, why it actually fails spectacularly, which is a challenge to many Christians, because I'd say a huge number of Christians that I know both believe in evolution and Christianity at the same time. And what we're gonna find out is whether that actually can make sense or not. So that might be a point of challenge for you. Again, my hope in this class is that you challenge your own presuppositions. And so that might be one that you get challenged on next week. Okay? That's it for today. And I'd be happy to stick around and answer any more questions in detail if you want. But thank you guys for being here. I hope that's great. I'm sorry I didn't send out I realized last night that I hadn't sent out the videos from last week because of the weird audio and how many videos there were. I will email those videos to you so you can get a copy of them. And I will send the information. This is called the information enigma. I'll send that out to you guys as well. So, yeah.
Quick question, do biology textbooks today address these problems, or do they avoid the problems?
I can bring in a brand new biology textbook if you want. We can look at it together.
Yeah, do it.
Okay? You'll actually see a lot of cool words in there.
If this is fact, if this is where science is and where biologists are wrestling with these things and trying to figure out COVID vaccines and that kind of thing, what are they saying? What are we teaching people?
That is a fantastic question, and anyway, I don't want to keep you guys any longer because we need to go to church because it starts in like 10 minutes. But if you want to stick around, I'd be happy to answer that.
Well, or some weave it in.
Yeah. Again, I usually bring in a textbook and we look at some of the cool words and how they're described. But that should give you a hint on what it teaches. It's what you'll find in a lot of things is that there's a dogma, and that the dogma is evolution is true, things happen by chance, and that's what the textbooks teach, regardless of any kind of arguments. So anyway, that's it for this week. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm really happy that you're continuing to stick with us. And anyway, blessings to all of you.